kids, when they tell you the layers are different ages, you tell them Kent Hovind said they're confused or they're lying. It is not correct.
Religious extremists often use irrational thinking, known as logical fallacies. And one of them is projection, where they project their own faults onto others. And one type of projection is the tu quo qui fallacy, essentially saying that you do it too. It's ignoring the flaws in their own side to pretend that both sides are just as bad, which is like the old adage of the pot calling the kettle black. However, in the creationism versus evolution discussion, believers more often project their own faults onto those who will not share them, like when they accuse science of being another competing religious faith. This form of projection is called the pot calling the silverware black. The truth is, this preacher is inexcusably confused on every subject he brings up, and it doesn't seem to matter to him whether he's right or wrong, just as long as he sounds confident. He appeals to his own self-proclaimed authority, which he does not have, on topics he does not understand, and he continues to defend his claims even when they have been repeatedly disproved. But that's not what I do, that's not what the scientists do, and that's not what the textbooks do.
Those layers all formed, nearly all of them, at the time of Noah's flood.
Except that we know for certain there was no time of Noah's flood. The creationist propaganda mill known as Answers in Genesis says that the flood occurred 2,370 years before the calendar we are currently using. Creation.com says it happened 63 years later in 2307 BC on that same calendar. And the Institute for Creation Research says it happened at some point in the middle in 2348 BC. And all three apologetics ministries used the same input data and I guess some really bad math to come up with three different answers from that. So let's take an average between them and say that the flood hypothetically happened in the year 2340 BC. It doesn't have to be on the Gregorian calendar, which was invented by Pope Gregory in 1582. He then backdated it to a point 6 years before and 4 years after the two conflicting dates given for when Jesus was supposed to have been born. We could use much older calendars too, so that we don't have to go into negative numbers. If we go by the Chinese calendar instead, then the mythic flood would have happened in their year 358. On the Hebrew calendar, it would have been 1420, and it would have been the year 2409 on the Yazidi calendar. Now, the reason there are three different ancient calendars, and the reason that none of them start at zero at that point, as they logically should following a giant flood like that, is that these cultures and their associated civilizations already existed before the flood never happened, and they all persisted right on through it without ever noticing that they were all suddenly living underwater. These histories continued as if that never happened, because it didn't.
80 to 85% of Earth's surface does not even have 3 geologic periods appearing in correct consecutive order.
We could just as easily say that 80 to 85% of the Earth's surface doesn't show any 3 exposed geologic periods all visible from the same place at the same time, depending on where you're standing. Of course, if you zoom out a bit, you'll be able to see more, and if you use a geologic map, you'll be able to see them all. And that 80 to 85% also leaves the 15 to 20% of the Earth's surface where multiple layers are visible in the same location. Like the Grand Canyon, for example, where we can see at least a dozen layers at once without even bringing a shovel. And they're always in the correct consecutive order, the same order they're in anywhere in the world. And more importantly, though, we can also say that nowhere, 0% of the Earth's land surface has any geologic periods appearing in the incorrect consecutive order. Even in areas of extreme folding, such as I've seen in South Africa, radiometric dating shows every one of those layers, always in the appropriate sequence. So the situation is not at all what the preacher wants you to think it is.
Even though this geologic column does not exist, except in the textbooks, that teaching is what changed people in the 1830s away from believing the Bible to believing in Uniformitarianism.
This preacher has no idea what he's talking about, and he's been corrected on this multiple times. In earlier episodes of this series, we've already seen that the entire geologic column can be seen in several places around the world, and we've seen that plenty of people living before the 1830s already thought that the world was very old, if not eternal, and that it was always subject to the same physical laws, that the laws of physics do not change. And this is not just in Europe, but around the rest of the world too, at a time when half the people had never seen or heard of a Bible.
This teaching especially affected a young preacher. He just got out of Bible college, studied to be a pastor of a church. His name was Charles Darwin. Anybody ever heard of Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin graduated from Bible college to be a preacher, and he's going to sail around the world for 5 years first and collect some bugs for some, bugologist back there in England. Charlie brought some books with him. He brought his Bible, of course. He just got out of Bible college. And he brought this brand new book, Principles of Geology. Charlie said that book changed his life forever. He later wrote to a friend and said, "Disbelief crept over me slowly. I felt no distress." He slowly lost his faith in the Bible.
Well, to be fair, biblical literalism wasn't always taken seriously even back then. But yes, Darwin started studying the Bible and eventually lost his faith in God, though that had much more to do with the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, and the death of his daughter later in life. Remember that he was still a believer when he worked out his theory on the evolutionary origin of species. Otherwise, I have noticed a pattern, with a few obvious exceptions, wherein the most outspoken proponents of religious dogmatism usually tend to be those who were raised religious and who have studied their own and other religions most deeply. I know of former ministers, missionaries, seminary students, biblical scholars, and a number of folks who were training to be preachers when they ultimately realized they just couldn't believe it anymore, especially not if you have to take it all literally. In fact, there was an unofficial poll at the National Convention of American Atheists, most of whom were raised Christian, asking the question of why they're not Christian anymore. What was it that changed their minds? The third most popular answer was understanding science, because biblical literalism is anti-scientific and it does make a lot of people atheist. The second most popular answer was the hypocrisy of the clergy, and not just the obvious examples that always come to mind. I've gotten a few emails to say that this particular preacher was the one who made them atheist. And the number one most common reason for why former Christians no longer believe in God is that
I read the Bible cover to cover.
If that's the case, then imagine how much worse it is when you don't just read the scriptures, but you study the history and the origins of them too.
Oh, you can't get through seminary and come out believing in God.
When you find out everything it says, and you think you have to believe on all of that as if it actually happened exactly as described, then it is literally unbelievable.
As Darwin sailed around the world, he stopped off at the Galapagos Islands. Here on those islands, he noticed there were 14 different varieties of finches. Little tiny bird with a little tiny beak. But the beak shapes were different. Now the Grants went there and studied them and said, wow, during dry years the beak is 1/10 of a millimeter thicker, and during wet years it's 1/10 of a millimeter thinner. But it always averages back out. 1/10 of a millimeter, do you know how much that is? Not much. Darwin looked at the birds and said, you know what? I think all these birds had a common ancestor. I bet you're right, Charlie. It was a bird.
Way to miss the point entirely. Yes, it was a bird. And not just any bird, it was a finch, but a different species of finch. See, finches are a taxonomic family, divided into 3 subfamilies, subdivided into 50 genera, and further subdivided into a couple hundred some odd species. Darwin wasn't measuring their beaks the way the Grants were. What he noticed was that the 14 different species of finch on the islands then, which are 18 species now, must have evolved their variety from a common ancestral flock who were blown to the islands from the continent several hundred miles away. And this preacher accepts that. He knows he can't argue against it, but neither can he admit what that means, because everyone, even this preacher, knows that we can and have bred many varieties of dogs, cats, cattle, and fowl, and that all the exact same mechanisms are why there are also different species of dogs, cats, cattle, and fowl too. When careless Linnaeus published the first natural system of classifying life in 1758, he was surprised that everything was arranged in a branching tree hierarchy, a sequence of multiple daughter groups in every parent taxa, and that this went on for generations in both directions. This is the pattern of a family tree, but it is inconsistent with the idea of the separate boxes of created kinds, such as Linnaeus initially expected. In each of these daughter sets, he saw that different species in a given genus could interbreed and produce only infertile hybrids, while species from 2 different genera, even in the same family, couldn't produce anything at all. So, whence come new species? Linnaeus was a creationist, albeit not the science-denying sort we have today. He thought that new species could only come about as an act of special creation by God, and consequently his natural system was a complete mystery, because it implied that speciation happened long after creation, and that it was still happening, frequently, which he could not understand. No one could. Others in later generations thought that new species had to come about some way, but how? A couple people had proposed ideas that just didn't work. And then eventually Darwin realized that he had proof of speciation, that from one species many different ones could be derived by a process called natural selection. Then he looked back at Linnaeus' taxonomic tree, and what was a mystery suddenly made sense. Natural speciation was the key to understanding taxonomy. This preacher knows most of that already, and while he says that he rejects Darwin's theory, he also contradicts himself by admitting that he accepts the origin of species by means of natural selection. But as we've already seen, he doesn't know anything about taxonomy, so he doesn't know how far any of this goes, or how we, and even he, can prove it.
And then Charlie said, well, maybe this proves that birds and bananas are related. You say, oh, he never said that. He sure did. I knew you wouldn't believe me, so I brought his book. It's right here. The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. On page 170, Darwin said, it's a truly wonderful fact that all animals and all plants throughout all time and space should be related to each other. Isn't he saying the birds and bananas are related? He sure is. This is a lie.
No, that is the truth. Plants and animals are related, albeit very distantly, having diverged a billion years or so ago. If you compare plants and animals, then you'll note the basic structure and see how close it is. But if you don't want people to see that, then don't say plants and animals. Instead, go from that point of division a billion years or so ago to a modern genus of banana, and compare that to a modern family of birds on the other end of a billion years of diversification the other way. And now your audience doesn't know what to compare, and they can't even imagine it anymore. I can't help them either, because if I were to trace a phylogeny of the family of finches through the order Passeriformes and the class of aves and the phylum Chordata, kingdom Animalia, actually Metazoa, and then turn around to trace kingdom Plantae through the phylum of vascular plants into class Liliospida and order Zingiberales, and finally Musacea to genus Musa, that would take too long. That would be a whole episode by itself. I had to eliminate myriad intermediate steps to squeeze all that into the shortest possible summary. That's precisely why the preacher rephrased it, to make the concept even more confusing to an audience that doesn't know any better, because young Earth creationism is a perspective with no depth. They think that the universe was poofed out of God's imagination very recently, and they barely know how many animals we still have alive today. They have no idea that that's just a tiny percentage of the genera that is already known from the fossil record. So there's a lot of ignorance to overcome, especially whenever believers are incurious and professional apologists are defending willful ignorance with misinformation. It's impossible to fill your mind with knowledge when it is already full of manure.
What Charlie observed is what is sometimes called microevolution.
No, what Darwin observed was macroevolution by definition. It was an evolutionary scientist who invented the words micro and macroevolution, so even though they are of little use to us now, science has established those definitions. We know what they mean. You can look them up on any academic source of secular science to see that microevolution is small-scale variation within a single species, while macroevolution is large-scale variation between species, including the emergence of new species. When Carolus Linnaeus invented his taxonomic ranks, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, only the last one was defined. The rules differ for asexual microbes and for plants, but for sexually reproductive animals, the basic criteria for species refers to any breeding pair capable of reproducing fertile offspring. This rule of the biological species concept is identical to the Hebrew word for kind, in that both are concerned with whether two animals can interbreed and bring forth fertile offspring after their kind. And once speciation happens, then if one member of the old species meets a member of the new species, they either can't or won't interbreed anymore, or they couldn't produce fertile offspring if they did, meaning that speciation is when they no longer bring forth after their kind. It's gradual. It doesn't happen overnight. The longer two groups remain reproductively isolated, the more unique mutations continue to build up in either group that are not shared with the other group. The more they grow apart, the lower the probability that they will be able to interbreed productively. Eventually, that probability falls to zero, where they can't interbreed at all anymore, and won't even try unless under duress or in captivity. Often there are two different species that can produce viable but infertile hybrids if they're in the same genus, but two species in different genera can't or won't produce anything living even if they're in the same family. And this trend isn't always consistent, because when people started naming genus and species, they didn't yet know about evolution, and they had no idea that the cheetah, for example, was more closely related to the American cougar than to any of the African cats. Those two are genetically close enough they could be in the same genus, But who knew that back then? So they were given different genus names, and we're stuck with that now. Thus, the only taxonomic rank that was ever defined at all is species. That's the most important, really the only important distinction in all of taxonomy, the only one that is defined. And once speciation happens, meaning when a new species evolves, then the new population is unrestricted by the former gene pool, and that group is free to keep on changing indefinitely. And every new variety after that begins with another speciation. That's why macroevolution starts with speciation and includes every other speciation after that. I've heard people ask to see the evolution of a new class or phylum, but that doesn't mean anything, literally, because class and phylum have no definition. They're just signposts on what are now a sea of taxonomic clades where every new branch at every level began with speciation. And the biblical concept of kinds and the biological species concept are the exact same thing, and creationists cannot admit that, even when they know better. They used to hold to that when they thought that no one had ever seen the evolution of a new species. For example, take a look at this clip from the 1990s.
The theory is perfectly valid at that level of minor changes that do not produce new kinds of organisms and that, above all, do not add to the genetic information. Breeders are able to produce change only within boundaries. Even those dogs are all members of a single biological species, which are chemically interfertile. We don't get dogs getting bigger and bigger indefinitely, as big as elephants or whales, much less changing into elephants or whales. And the claim that if selective breeding hasn't produced the kind of macro changes, the kinds of new forms of life, new complex organs that are needed, that's only because there hasn't been enough time.
He is very clearly associating kinds with species because he thought it was safe to say that back then. Many times as a kid I heard people say that no one had ever seen a new species evolve, but once the fundamentalists realized that speciation actually had been directly observed and documented too many times to deny, then they tried to redefine kinds as something different from species in order to move the goalposts up to an uncertain and, if necessary, variable position higher up in the taxonomic ranks.
Probably the kind indicates somewhere around the family or genus level. Everything above that is speculation.
Notice how he says probably without any data to back him up at all? That's him speculating. I am not speculating. As you can see, I'm doing something he can't do. I'm sourcing experts and providing testable data to prove my point.
Microevolution tells us dogs produce a variety of dogs. That's a fact. It happens, okay? And roses produce a variety of roses. Nobody argues about that. The question is, does it go any farther than that? You may get a big dog or a little dog, but you get a dog every time.
This preacher relies on a straw man misrepresentation of evolution, which we'll cover in the next episode. For the moment, yes, microevolution is when hundreds of wildly varied domestic dog breeds can be derived from one or very few original breeds. Macroevolution is when different varieties of canids, for example, continue to diversify to become different species of dogs.
And probably the dog, the wolf, and the coyote had a common ancestor. I wouldn't argue about that.
Here we see that the preacher accepts speciation, the evolutionary origin of species.
Variations within species and even creation of new species is possible and has been observed. That is science and is no problem for Bible believers.
Thus we see that the preacher technically accepts macroevolution, though he will not say that. I've pointed this out to him a few times directly, and he cannot admit that that's what the word really means and that he had it wrong all these years.
We did the test this morning. Had a 5-year-old girl. Said, okay, here we have a dog, a wolf, a coyote, and a banana. Which one is not like the others? She got it. The banana. We got college professors can't figure that out.
Notice that the preacher took 3 different species of canid that are all so closely related that fertile hybrids are still possible, even if that can only be done in captivity, so that some people would use that to say that they're still the same species. And he has compared these virtually identical animals to an example of a plant. He purposefully chose the most distantly related thing the preacher could think of. And he insists on posing this to 5-year-old children, knowing that adults could see through what he's doing. Believers can't and won't play this game correctly, as we'll see more in the next episode. Very often I ask creationists whether they accept that all domestic dog breeds are biologically related, which is microevolution. And usually they will agree with that, if that's the only question I ask. And then I ask if they also accept that All domestic dog breeds are biologically related to wolves, which is technically macroevolution, though that transition is not yet complete. They still haven't grown very far apart and can produce fertile hybrids. So let's push it back a bit further. Are all domestic dog breeds biologically related to wolves and the South American bush dog, the Asian raccoon dog, and the African painted dog, as well as foxes and the maned wolf and so on? If I get an answer to that at all, which I usually don't, then that answer will be dependent on whether they can interbreed and bring forth after their kind, which means species. But these are not just breeds of the same species. These are different species of dogs. Domestic dogs and painted dogs cannot interbreed. They've grown too far apart genetically. Yet any 5-year-old would tell you that they're the same kind, whatever that means. And that's the problem. Creationists cannot admit when they're wrong about this, not even when they know it, as this preacher definitely does. Instead, they have to move the goalposts and pretend that kind means something else, though they refuse to define what it is or how to tell, because they know that what they're saying is not evidently true. There is no such thing as a kind other than species. They know that evolution, even macroevolution, is real and really happening, and that they dare not admit that. If you believe something on faith, and you've made that who you are, then you cannot admit when it's wrong, because that would change your identity. And now imagine when it's also your career.
Here's National Geographic says, the evolution of dogs from wolves. Well, duh, nobody's arguing about that. Yeah, dogs came from wolves, okay?
The article isn't trying to convince anyone that that happened so much as to try to explain how that happened, because some people are curious and they like to understand how things really work.
The Bible says they bring forth after their kind. 10 times it says that in the first chapter.
But the Bible never defines what a kind is, other than to say that they can interbreed and bring forth, which means they're talking about the same species. And if you accept speciation, then you're talking about mixing two now different kinds of dogs or cats, cattle, finches, or what have you, that can no longer bring forth after their own species, nor any other kind of taxa anymore. That's why speciation is macroevolution.